The smooth muscle contracts with a different mechanism comparing the skeletal muscle does. The smooth muscle contracts slowly and also is asynchronously. For the skeletal muscle, it contracts fast and also asynchronously to prevent fatigue, if you recall our previous class. The smooth muscle contraction also need calcium ions and energy as a form of ATP and can be regulated by nerves. That is very similar to the skeletal muscle. But here we see the smooth muscle are regulated by nerves. Instead, we see controlled by nerve in the skeletal muscle. So that's different. Smooth muscle can only be regulated by your nervous system, so we call it involuntary. But however, the skeletal muscle is fully controlled by the nervous system, and that's you consider it to be voluntary. And also our smooth muscle can be regulated by hormones and a local chemical change. The smooth muscle can contract without nerve impulse as well. So that's a different for from the skeletal muscle as well. In our book, the figure 9.28, there are 5 different steps about the smooth muscle contraction. Please compare the pathway of the smooth muscle contraction with the pathway of the skeletal muscle contraction. So first, in the smooth muscle contraction, calcium ion will enter those cells. So here what you see is the cell membrane, and the calcium ions channel open. 2 calcium ion channel open. One is on the cell membrane. See here, that's a cell membrane, and the other calcium ion channel is on the SR. Okay, so those calcium ion channel open, calcium will go into the cell. Smooth muscle need calcium to contract the same as a skeletal muscle does. But here you see how the calcium enter the cell. It's from the extracellular fluid, this part, as well as the SR. But however, in smooth muscle, all the calcium are from the SR, not from the extracellular fluid. So once the calcium enters the cell, the calcium will bind to a protein called comedolin. Comedolin will change its shape upon binding calcium ions. And once the shape gets changed, we call this comedolin is activated. The comedolin activates another protein, the myosin light chain kinase, and that is an enzyme. That enzyme will transfer phosphorus group to the myosin and activate the myosin ATPase. At last, the activated myosin form cross bridges with the actin myofilament and contract the muscle, very similar to the skeletal muscle at this step. So did you see the difference between the smooth muscle and the skeletal muscle contraction? So compare this whole pathway with a skeletal muscle from the action potential reach the neuromuscular junction till the muscle contract. So the EC coupling and the cross-bridge cycles. Compare that with our smooth muscle contraction, and there's at least 3 very significant difference here. So one is, where do they get calcium? That's number 1. So calcium, smooth muscle get most of their calcium from the ECF, the extracellular fluid, and also some from the ER, but because the smooth muscle just have very skeletal ER, so compared to the skeletal muscle, most of the calcium are from the extracellular matrix. But for the skeletal muscle, they get all the calcium ions from the ER. Okay, so that's the number one. And the second one is a binding site of the calcium. Commodolin in small ER receive calcium and change the shape and then activate the following steps. But however, in skeletal muscle, what is a protein bind calcium inside the skeletal muscle fiber? That's troponin. Remember that? Troponin bind calcium and then review the tropomyosin to allow the myosin head bind to the actin. So that's the second difference. And the third, very easy to see here is, let's make it blue here, make it black. Okay, so here is the myosin head in the smooth muscle bind to the phosphor group, but however in the skeletal muscle, it's ATP bind to the myosin head directly. Once the ATP get hydrolyzed, then ADP and one phosphor group will bind on the myosin head, but in the smooth muscle, the ATP or ADP do not bind to the head. So above are those differences between skeletal muscle and smooth muscle contraction. If I give you one information, for example, commodolin, you should know is required for the smooth muscle contraction, but not skeletal muscle contraction. And like a troponin, only seen in the skeletal muscle contraction, not in the smooth muscle contraction. So to understand those three differences are very important to compare the skeletal muscle and smooth muscle contraction here. In different organs, the smooth muscle fiber organize differently, the neuron innervate the muscle fibers differently, and also the smooth muscle responsiveness are different. So by structure, we are able to divide the smooth muscle and separate them into two different groups. And we name them as a unitary and a multi-unit smooth muscle. The unitary smooth muscle are united together and they are united by gap junction. As in this picture, you can see those are the gap junctions that connected those cells together. It is also called a visceral smooth muscle because this type of smooth muscle are around the viscera. Those are the inner organ in the abdominal pelvic cavity, like your stomach, small intestine, large intestines. Okay, so they are usually arranged in two layers. Those are so-called opposing sheath. So one is in the longitudinal, the other is in the circular direction. And they can generate their own action potential, although they do receive some nerve impulse from the neuron system, and those are the varicosities, like those bubbles here. And the most important things are the gap junction. Once you see the gap junction, you know it's a unitary, and that's why we call it unitary, because all those cells are united as a one by those gap junction. So all those cells have small holes in between to allow those nerve impulse, allow those action potential to go through them at the same time. So it's a synchronized each other for the contraction. The other type of smooth muscle is a multi-unit. The multi-unit smooth muscle, as in this picture, you can see there's no gap junction. No gap junction, and in fact, there's no spontaneous depolarization as in the unitary smooth muscle either. So because there's no gap junction, so they are not united together, we just call it a multi-unit. And you can find this multi-unit smooth muscle in our airways, large arteries, iris in the eye and also the erector pili in your skin to erect the hair. Okay, so basically everything, every smooth muscle except the one in the visceral organs. So those multi-unit smooth muscle fibers are innervated by autonomic nervous system. It's an ANS. The ANS control those involuntary function of our body. And we also can see those graded contraction occurs in those smooth muscle in response to the neuron stimulus. And also there's a motor unit and it will respond to hormone. And the hormone response part is very similar to the smooth muscle, and the motor unit is more close to the skeletal muscle here. So far we talked about the skeletal muscle and smooth muscle. Please organize your note and see how many differences can you find between these two muscles in structures and also in functions. In fact, your book gave you a table 9.3, which is a good and a long list about all three muscle tissue types. I would suggest you make a copy of this table and cut those content into flashcard, like this card, one card, second, and a third, things like that. Okay, then test yourself by putting them back into the group, the skeletal muscle group or smooth muscle group. For the cardiac muscle, read through the whole table once, but just in fact it's very similar to the skeletal muscle, and be more focused for the location and the function for the cardiac muscle. But for the skeletal muscle and the smooth muscle, you are required to know everything in this table. Okay, so this table is much longer than this slide here. Please read your textbook for the full information about this table.